May 4, 1945, Kufstein, Austria. The war in Europe was almost over. By early May 1945, Adolf Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and the once mighty Third Reich was collapsing in chaos. But in the heart of Austria, where the jagged peaks of the Alps met the last pockets of resistance, the guns had not yet fallen silent. Across the countryside, small units of the German army, some still loyal, others desperate to surrender, moved through burning villages and shattered roads. Civilians wandered aimlessly, clutching what little they could carry. Bridges were destroyed, railways torn apart, and food was almost gone. For many, it was no longer a question of victory or defeat. It was survival. In the small Austrian town of Kufstein, near the German border, the American 12th Armored Division pushed forward cautiously. Each day, they encountered surrendering Wehrmacht soldiers, exhausted men, more relieved than defiant. Yet even in these final hours, not all Germans were ready to give up. Among the mountains lurked remnants of SS fanatics, determined to fight to the last bullet. Hidden high above the Tyrolean countryside stood Castle Itter, a medieval fortress surrounded by forest and rock. To most locals, it was just another stone relic of the past. But in 1943, the Nazi regime had given it a dark new purpose. The castle had been transformed into a prison, a special detention center for high-profile French captives. Inside its cold stone walls were not soldiers, but politicians, generals, and cultural figures, men who had once shaped the destiny of France. Among them were former French Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, General Maurice Gamelin, and even Charles de Gaulle's own sister, Marie-Agnes Caillaux. They lived under constant threat, guarded by SS troops who obeyed orders without hesitation. Food was scarce, morale was low, and the prisoners knew their fate depended on the chaos outside. With the Reich falling apart, rumors spread that the SS planned to execute all political prisoners before retreating. It was a fear that grew more real with every passing hour. In the surrounding villages, German officers watched as command structures dissolved. Some units fled toward the mountains, hoping to avoid capture. Others sought surrender to the Allies, knowing that falling into Soviet hands could mean death. Amid this disarray stood Major Josef Gangl, a seasoned officer of the Wehrmacht. For years, he had served loyally under the German flag. But now, with the war lost and the SS turning their guns even on their own countrymen, Gangl faced a choice that would define his life and his death. He had already begun cooperating with Austrian resistance fighters, protecting civilians from senseless destruction ordered by retreating SS units. To him, honor no longer meant obedience. It meant doing what was right, even if it meant defying his own command. Just miles away, Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee Jr. of the U.S. 23rd Tank Battalion had his own mission: advance, secure territory, and rescue any Allied prisoners he could find. He was young, confident, and battle-tested, leading a small but determined armored group through enemy territory. He didn't know it yet, but his path and Gangl's were about to cross, in one of the strangest alliances in military history. As dusk settled over the Tyrolean mountains, the war seemed ready to end. But inside Castle Itter, tension was rising. The SS guards were growing restless, their loyalty to the crumbling Reich more dangerous than ever. The French prisoners could hear gunfire echoing in the valleys below. Each shot reminded them that time was running out. Then, on the night of May 4, 1945, something extraordinary happened. A Czech cook, Andreas Krobot, managed to slip past the SS guards and escape through the forest. He carried with him a desperate message for help, written by the prisoners themselves. His mission: find the Allies, no matter the cost. Through dense woods and occupied roads, Krobot made his way down the mountain, risking execution if captured. Hours later, exhausted and terrified, he reached the outskirts of Kufstein, where he found Major Gangl and a small group of German soldiers who had already turned against the SS. That moment, an escaped prisoner, a German major in rebellion, and a castle full of French captives, set into motion one of the most remarkable confrontations of the Second World War. A battle where Americans and Germans would fight side by side, not as enemies, but as allies against the fanatics of their own making. The story of Castle Itter was about to begin. The fortress of prisoners. Morning broke over the Austrian Alps, pale sunlight cutting through a thin veil of mist. The air was still, almost peaceful, but inside Castle Itter, fear and uncertainty filled every shadow. For 2 years, the fortress had stood as one of the Nazi regime's most secret prisons. Unlike the sprawling concentration camps of Dachau or Buchenwald, Castle Itter held only a handful of captives, men whose names had once carried immense weight in European politics. They were France's elite, politicians, generals, and dignitaries who had led the nation before its fall in 1940. Among them was Paul Reynaud, the fiery former prime minister who had opposed Nazi Germany long before the invasion of France. His political rival, Édouard Daladier, the man who had signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler in 1938, was here too, now his fellow prisoner. General Maurice Gamelin, commander of French forces during the Battle of France, lived in quiet humiliation, haunted by the defeat that had destroyed his career. Even Jean Borotra, the famous tennis champion known as the Bounding Basque, shared their captivity, his athletic pride dimmed by months behind stone walls. The irony was not lost on them. Men who had once governed a nation were now reduced to waiting helplessly in a medieval fortress in the Alps. Their guards, Waffen-SS troops, watched them with suspicion, unsure what to do as the Reich collapsed. Food was scarce. Supplies had stopped arriving weeks earlier. The prisoners scavenged for scraps, relying on the kindness of the Czech cook, Andreas Krobot, who risked severe punishment to sneak them extra rations. Each night, they could hear distant artillery echoing through the valleys, the sound of the Allied advance drawing closer. At first, those sounds had brought hope. But soon, the prisoners realized that liberation might come too late. Rumors spread that SS units, retreating from the front, had received orders to execute all political prisoners to prevent them from being freed. The men of Castle Itter feared their days were numbered. Inside the fortress, tensions among the prisoners were as thick as the stone walls themselves. Old rivalries flared. The French politicians argued endlessly. Reynaud accused Daladier of weakness. Daladier blamed Gamelin for the army's failures. Even in captivity, they debated France's fate as if they were still in Parliament. But beneath the arguments lay something deeper: fear, pride, and the knowledge that history would judge them not for their survival, but for what they represented. Then came the night that changed everything. On May 4, 1945, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the guards at Castle Itter began abandoning their posts. One by one, they slipped away into the forest, their loyalty to the SS dissolving with the Reich itself. By midnight, only a handful remained. Sensing the danger, Andreas Krobot, the castle's cook, decided to act. He knew that if the remaining SS troops decided to follow their final orders, the prisoners would be executed before dawn. Slipping through a back passage and down a narrow forest trail, Krobot began his desperate journey toward Kufstein. He moved by moonlight, avoiding roads and villages, terrified of running into SS patrols. Every sound, a branch snapping, a dog barking, sent chills down his spine. But he kept going, driven by one thought: the message in his pocket. It was a plea for rescue, signed by the most important prisoners in Europe. By sunrise, Krobot had covered nearly 8 miles through enemy territory. In the small town of Wergel, he stumbled upon a unit of German soldiers who were different. Their commander, Major Josef Gangl, was a man at war with himself, torn between his duty to the army and his conscience. Gangl had already made his choice. He had turned his weapons away from the SS and toward the defense of local civilians, protecting them from fanatic officers who still obeyed Hitler's ghost. When Krobot told him about the French prisoners, Gangl knew immediately what had to be done. He couldn't rescue them alone. His small force, barely a dozen men, lacked the strength to hold off an SS counterattack. So, in an act of sheer defiance and desperation, he decided to do something no German officer had ever done before. He would seek help from the Americans. With a white flag raised over his convoy, Gangl set out toward the advancing U.S. lines. His destination, the American-held town of Kufstein, only a few miles away. His mission, convince the Allies to join forces with him, a German major, to save French prisoners from execution by the SS. When he arrived, the Americans were stunned. A Wehrmacht officer, approaching under a truce flag, asking to fight against the SS? It sounded impossible. But Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee Jr. of the 23rd Tank Battalion listened carefully. He recognized courage when he saw it. Gangl's information was precise: names, locations, numbers. This wasn't a trap. It was a plea for humanity. Without waiting for higher orders, Lee made his decision. He would go, with his Sherman tank, a handful of men, and Major Gangl at his side. Together, they would drive into enemy territory, to a castle full of French prisoners, surrounded by fanatical SS troops. It was a mission with almost no chance of survival. But it was also a moment that would redefine the meaning of the word ally. As Lee's column rumbled out of Kufstein, engines roaring and tracks grinding through the alpine dirt, the morning sun rose over the peaks. The war was almost over, but one final battle, perhaps the strangest of the entire conflict, was about to begin. A battle where Americans and Germans would fight together, shoulder to shoulder, against the same enemy. A battle that history would later call the last battle of World War II. The road to the castle. The convoy rolled out of Kufstein under the thin light of dawn. The rumble of the Sherman tank, named Bissat and Jenny, echoed through the narrow streets, followed by a small column of jeeps and trucks carrying a handful of American GIs and a few dozen German soldiers, the strangest alliance the war had ever seen. At the head of the convoy rode Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee Jr., a tank commander known for his quick thinking and stubborn courage. Beside him sat Major Josef Gangl, the German officer who had once fought for the Wehrmacht and now rode into battle against the remnants of his own army. Neither man knew if they would make it back alive. But both understood one thing clearly: they were fighting for something greater than nations, flags, or orders. They were fighting for what was right. The road climbed steeply toward the Tyrolean Alps. Pine forests closed in around them, and the air grew thin and cold. The towns they passed through were eerily quiet. Windows were shattered, signs torn down, the people hiding behind curtains, unsure who to trust anymore. The war had stripped everything bare. Every few miles, the column stopped to check for ambushes. The SS still patrolled the area, desperate and unpredictable. Each turn could reveal an enemy machine gun nest or a sniper hiding in the trees. But the Americans and Germans pressed forward, their uneasy alliance sealed by necessity. In the village of Wergel, they met resistance. A small group of SS loyalists had barricaded the main road, refusing to surrender. Gunfire erupted, a brief but violent clash that echoed off the mountain walls. For the first time, the U.S. soldiers saw the Wehrmacht men fighting beside them, not against them. When the smoke cleared, the SS had fled, leaving several dead behind. It was a strange sight, Americans and Germans working together to clear debris, reload ammunition, and check for wounded. In another time, just days earlier, they would have been killing each other. Now they were brothers in arms, bound by the shared goal of saving lives instead of taking them. As they moved higher into the mountains, the roads grew narrower and the air colder. Lee's Sherman tank struggled over the rocky path, its engine groaning with every turn. The men could see the snow-capped peaks rising ahead, and somewhere among them, the gray stone silhouette of Castle Itter. Along the way, they picked up a few members of the Austrian resistance, men armed with old rifles, wearing civilian clothes, their eyes burning with hatred for the SS. They joined the convoy without hesitation. By the time they neared the castle, the small force had grown to barely 24 men, Americans, Germans, and Austrians, fighting as one. Gangl briefed Lee on what to expect. The castle, he explained, sat atop a steep hill with only one narrow road leading in. The prisoners inside were unarmed, terrified, and vulnerable. And the SS, once they discovered what had happened, would likely attack in force to finish their orders. As they neared the final stretch, the air filled with the smell of smoke. Villages burned in the distance, reminders that even as the Reich collapsed, fanaticism still consumed what was left of it. At one point, a burst of machine gun fire tore through the trees. The convoy halted, engines silent, every man gripping his weapon. Moments later, 2 SS soldiers bolted from the woods, fleeing, not attacking. They were shot down before they could reach cover. The road ahead was now clear. The closer they got to the castle, the more surreal the mission became. American troops were riding in formation with Wehrmacht soldiers, sharing ammunition, exchanging nods, and covering each other's flanks. War had stripped away the propaganda, leaving only men, human beings, trying to survive and do the right thing. As night fell, the convoy finally reached the base of the hill. There, under the dark outline of the fortress, the men dismounted. The last rays of sunlight glinted off the castle's high walls, cold and silent against the sky. Somewhere inside, the French prisoners waited, unaware that their unlikely rescuers were almost there. Lee ordered his men to proceed quietly. The Sherman tank rumbled up the winding road, followed by the soldiers on foot. Each step was cautious, every sound amplified by the stillness of the forest. When they reached the main gate, it stood half open, abandoned by the fleeing guards. The rescuers moved in swiftly, weapons ready. A shout rang out in French, followed by a rush of footsteps. Moments later, the gates swung fully open, and for the first time, the prisoners of Castle Itter saw the men who had come to save them. To their astonishment, American uniforms stood beside German ones. For a moment, no one spoke. The prisoners simply stared, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. But when they realized the truth, relief and disbelief washed over them in equal measure. After 2 years of captivity, they were finally free, rescued not just by the Allies, but by one of their former enemies. The liberation of Castle Itter was not yet complete. The SS were regrouping in the nearby forest, preparing a counterattack. The men inside the castle, Americans, Germans, Austrians, and French, now had to do the unthinkable. They would have to fight together to defend the fortress until reinforcements could arrive. The battle for Castle Itter, the last battle of the war in Europe, was about to begin. The defense of the fortress. May 5, 1945. Dawn broke over the Austrian Alps, painting the peaks in soft gold. From the towers of Castle Itter, the defenders could see the mist rising over the valleys, and beyond it, the faint glint of movement in the forest. They knew what it meant. The SS were coming. Inside the fortress, chaos turned to discipline. Lieutenant Jack Lee and Major Joseph Gangl organized their ragtag garrison, a strange brotherhood of Americans, Wehrmacht soldiers, Austrian resistance fighters, and the French VIP prisoners themselves. There were barely 20 defenders in total. They faced a force of more than 150 SS troops, heavily armed and determined to erase every trace of treason and surrender. The French dignitaries, men like former Prime Ministers Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, General Maxime Weygand, and tennis champion Jean Borotra, were not soldiers. But this morning, surrounded by rifles and ammunition belts, they understood that their survival depended on fighting back. Lee quickly assigned positions. Machine guns were placed at the windows overlooking the main road. Snipers took position in the towers. The Sherman tank, Bissot and Jenny, was parked near the front gate to cover the approach. Gangl's German troops, familiar with SS tactics, reinforced weak points along the walls. It was a fortress, but it was old, crumbling, and never built for modern warfare. Every stone echoed with tension. The first shots rang out around 10 a.m. The SS advanced through the forest, their black uniforms moving like shadows between the trees. Mortar rounds began to fall near the castle walls, sending shards of stone flying through the air. The defenders returned fire, American M1 rifles and German Mausers cracking side by side. For the first time in history, the U.S. Army and Wehrmacht fought shoulder to shoulder, not out of alliance, but out of humanity. From his position on the parapet, Jack Lee shouted orders, his voice hoarse over the gunfire. Beside him, Gangl moved calmly, directing his men, occasionally stepping out of cover to spot targets. He knew the risk. Every time he showed himself, the SS snipers were watching. But he refused to hide. Down below, the French prisoners did their part, carrying ammunition, tending to the wounded, and keeping morale alive. One of them, Jean Borotra, volunteered for a daring mission, to slip through the enemy lines and summon reinforcements from Wehrmacht. Armed with nothing but determination, he vaulted over the castle wall and vanished into the woods. The hours dragged on. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on ammunition. Each wave of the SS assault brought them closer. Bullets chipped away at the stone. The Sherman tank roared, its cannon thundering into the forest, but eventually its ammunition ran dry. Smoke hung over the courtyard, thick and choking. The castle's ancient walls trembled under the pressure of modern war. Still, the defenders held. Inside, the French politicians who had once been bitter rivals now found themselves side by side, loading rifles and comforting the wounded. Old enemies united by survival. In those desperate hours, ideology vanished, replaced by shared courage. Then, around midday, disaster struck. A sniper's bullet found Major Joseph Gangl as he dashed across the courtyard to move a wounded civilian woman out of harm's way. He fell instantly, killed in action by the very men he had once served beside. His death was a turning point. For a moment, silence gripped the defenders, then fury replaced fear. Lee's men fought harder, firing until their barrels smoked. They would not let Gangl's sacrifice be in vain. By afternoon, the SS closed in from three sides. A machine gun nest on the ridge pinned the defenders down. Grenades exploded in the courtyard. The castle's defenses were nearly gone. But just when the situation seemed hopeless, when the last magazines were nearly empty, a distant rumble rose from the valley below. Engines. Tanks. Voices shouting in English. Reinforcements. Jack Lee climbed to the parapet and saw the glint of American armor advancing up the road, units from the 142nd Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 36th Division. Jean Borotra had made it through. The relief column, led by Captain John Jack Kramer, had arrived just in time. The SS, caught between the defenders and the approaching Americans, broke and fled into the forest. The battle was over. After hours of fighting, the castle stood battered but unbroken. Its defenders, American, German, Austrian, and French, emerged into the light, exhausted but alive. The last battle of World War II in Europe had ended, not in hatred, but in unity. The aftermath and redemption. The echoes of battle faded into the mountain wind. For the first time in days, Castle Itter stood quiet. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the stone walls, mingling with smoke and dust, but the gunfire had stopped, replaced by the hum of engines and the murmurs of the living. Bodies of fallen SS soldiers lay scattered around the slopes below. Inside the courtyard, American GIs and German Wehrmacht soldiers tended to the wounded together, a scene no historian could have imagined a week earlier. Captain Jack Lee stood silently by the body of Major Joseph Gangl, the German officer who had sacrificed his life to protect civilians and prisoners. Moments earlier, they had fought side by side. Now Lee knelt and removed his helmet in respect, not for an enemy, but for a soldier of honor. Nearby, the French dignitaries, men who had once commanded armies and ruled governments, gathered quietly. Their faces, once marked by pride in politics, now bore the solemn expressions of men who had witnessed both the worst and best of humanity. One of them whispered, "This castle will forever remind us that courage can be found in unexpected places." American medics worked swiftly, moving from man to man, treating wounds without regard to uniform. A young GI offered his canteen to a wounded German. An Austrian resistance fighter shared his last piece of bread with a French prisoner. The labels of war, enemy, ally, traitor, seemed meaningless here. As the sun set over the Tyrolean hills, golden light washed over the battered fortress. The day's violence had ended in something rare, mutual respect. For the French prisoners, freedom had come in the most astonishing way imaginable. Not through the liberation of Paris, or a diplomatic handover, but through the bravery of Americans and Germans fighting together against a common evil. They would never forget it. When the 142nd Infantry fully secured the area, Castle Itter became a symbol of both tragedy and redemption. Word of the battle spread quickly through the American ranks, though few could believe it. U.S. and Wehrmacht soldiers fighting side by side against the SS? It sounded like fiction. But it was real, and it had happened just 3 days before Germany's unconditional surrender. In the following hours, American troops carefully transported the French dignitaries down the mountain to safety. They were greeted not as prisoners, but as heroes returning from the shadows of history. Jack Lee, exhausted and covered in dust, received quiet congratulations from his men. He was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, but to those who knew him, his greatest reward was not a medal. It was the simple truth that he had done what was right. And somewhere in the Austrian soil, beneath the shadow of the fortress, Major Joseph Gangl was laid to rest, honored by both sides. In Wurgl, a street was later named after him. To this day, he is remembered not as a Nazi, but as a German who defied tyranny. The Battle for Castle Itter became known as the strangest battle of World War II. But for those who were there, it was something more. It was a brief moment when enemies chose humanity over ideology, compassion over obedience. It was proof that even at the end of the world's darkest war, light could still emerge. The forgotten story of Castle Itter. When the war finally ended, Europe exhaled, a continent in ruins, a world trying to comprehend the cost of peace. Millions were dead, cities were ashes, and soldiers, from every nation, returned home with stories that no one wanted to hear. In that chaos, the battle for Castle Itter quietly vanished into the fog of history. There were no grand parades, no headlines, no victory photos. Just a few official reports, dry military memos buried in the archives of the U.S. Army. For the men who had fought there, it became a memory too strange to explain. How could they tell others that American GIs and German Wehrmacht soldiers had stood shoulder to shoulder? That French politicians had taken up rifles alongside them? That an SS unit had been defeated by a force that defied every rule of the war? It sounded impossible. And so, for decades, it remained a forgotten legend. In the post-war years, Lieutenant Jack Lee returned to the United States. He lived quietly, rarely speaking about what had happened at the castle. To most, he was just another veteran among thousands, a man who had done his duty and moved on. But inside, he carried the memory of that strange, heroic stand, the faces of the men he fought with, and the one he'd lost, Major Joseph Gangl. Across the Atlantic, in Austria, the story lived on in whispers. In Wurgl, the townspeople never forgot the German officer who had defied the SS to save civilians. Every year, they placed flowers at Gangl's memorial, honoring not a soldier of the Reich, but a man of conscience. Decades passed. The world's attention shifted, to the Cold War, to new conflicts, to modern politics. And Castle Itter faded further from memory. The fortress itself, scarred by bullets and shrapnel, stood silently over the valley, a relic of something few understood. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians stumbled upon the records again. Declassified American reports, interviews with surviving veterans, and fragments from French and Austrian archives began to piece together the truth. What they uncovered stunned even the most seasoned researchers. A real battle, fought after Hitler's death, where Americans, Germans, Austrians, and Frenchmen had fought together, united not by command, but by conscience. Writers called it the strangest battle of World War II. But others saw it differently, as the most human. In the 1970s and 1980s, documentaries and military historians began to revisit the event. Names like Lee, Gangl, and Itter entered the record once more. French survivors spoke in interviews, recalling their disbelief when they saw German and American soldiers defending them side by side. Castle Itter, once a fortress of imprisonment, became a symbol of reconciliation, a place where enemies remembered their shared humanity. By the time the world rediscovered the story, most of the men who had fought there were gone. But their legacy remained carved into the stones of the castle itself. Visitors today can still see the bullet holes, The damaged towers, silent witnesses to one of the most extraordinary moments of World War II. It's said that on quiet evenings, when the wind moves through the valley, you can almost hear the echo of that final stand, the gunfire fading, replaced by the sound of footsteps, and perhaps the faint, haunting whisper of soldiers who once refused to be enemies. The legacy of the impossible alliance. History often remembers wars by their victors and their villains. By the flags raised, the treaties signed, and the cities that fell. But sometimes, in the margins of war, in moments too small for strategy and too human for politics, we find the true measure of courage. The Battle of Castle Itter was one such moment. On May 5, 1945, the soldiers who fought there were not bound by allegiance, nor driven by orders. They were bound by moral clarity, the understanding that what was right transcended uniform, nation, and ideology. For Lieutenant John Jack Lee, it was a decision made in instinct, not strategy. When he saw that French prisoners were under threat, he did not wait for command approval or reinforcements. He acted, because in his eyes, a soldier's duty did not end with national boundaries. It ended where human life was at stake. For Major Joseph Gangl, it was redemption in its purest form. A German officer who had once fought for the Third Reich now stood against it, not in the name of surrender, but of conscience. His defiance of the SS, his alliance with American forces, and his ultimate sacrifice were not acts of betrayal to Germany, but of loyalty to human decency. When Gangl was killed by a sniper's bullet, he fell not as a Nazi, nor as a German, but as a man who had chosen to do what was right, even at the cost of everything. In the Austrian town of Wehrmacht, his name would forever be remembered. A street, Joseph Gangl Strasse, still bears his memory, a small but enduring reminder that even in darkness, redemption is possible. The French prisoners, politicians, generals, and statesmen who had once bitterly disagreed, found themselves united by survival. Among them were Paul Reynaud, Édouard Daladier, and General Maurice Gamelin, men whose political rivalries had divided France before its fall. But inside the fortress walls, those differences vanished. They fought together, not as leaders or opponents, but as men who shared the same fragile hope, to live. The American GIs, many of them young men from farms and factories, witnessed something they would never forget: former enemies fighting beside them against the remnants of tyranny. For some, it shattered the black and white vision of war they had grown up believing. They learned that courage and honor were not the property of one flag, but the shared inheritance of all who choose to stand against evil. In the years after the war, the story of Castle Itter would quietly resurface, inspiring historians, writers, and soldiers alike. When author Stephen Harding published The Last Battle in 2013, the world rediscovered what had nearly been lost: a story of unity in defiance of division. Harding's meticulous research revealed not just the tactical details, but the moral truth of that day. He wrote, "It was a moment when human beings, stripped of ideology, remembered that courage needs no permission." The U.S. Army later recognized Jack Lee with the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership and valor. But the men who had fought at his side, both American and German, were bound by something no metal could express. They had witnessed the impossible: enemies transformed into allies, hatred turned into understanding, chaos into solidarity. The legacy of Castle Itter goes beyond its walls, beyond its battle. It reminds us that even in history's darkest hours, there exists a spark, a moment when humanity refuses to be extinguished. When men remember that the real enemy is not the uniform before them, but the cruelty that seeks to divide them. Today, the fortress still stands, its stone towers silent, its courtyard empty. But its story continues to echo through generations. Teachers tell it. Soldiers study it. Historians preserve it. And those who visit the site feel something deeper than the chill of the mountain wind. They feel the weight of what it meant. The Battle of Castle Itter was not just the last battle of World War II in Europe. It was a moment of moral clarity in a world clouded by chaos, a brief, shining proof that even in war, humanity can still triumph. The final reflection: lessons from the last battle. May 5, 1945. It was just one day before the official end of the war in Europe, yet at a small fortress in the Austrian Alps, men were still fighting, still dying, still making choices that would echo far beyond the gunfire. What happened at Castle Itter was not grand in scale. No vast armies clashed there. No city was liberated. But in its simplicity, in the moral clarity of that stand, the battle revealed something deeper about the human condition. It showed that war, even in its final hours, cannot completely destroy the capacity for conscience. That a German officer could turn his rifle against the tyranny he once served. That American soldiers could trust their former enemies to stand beside them. That French prisoners, broken and weary, could pick up weapons to fight for their freedom one last time. This was not a battle of nations. It was a battle of principles. And in that sense, it was one of the purest fights of the entire war. In every generation, history tends to flatten war into good versus evil, right versus wrong. But Castle Itter reminds us that humanity lives in the gray spaces, where decisions are made not by ideology, but by courage. Where enemies can discover their shared morality. Where redemption, though costly, is still possible. When Major Joseph Gangl fell in battle, his death carried no glory, no fanfare, only the silence of a man who had finally found peace through sacrifice. In his final act, he proved that it is never too late to stand on the right side of history. His town, Wörgl, still honors him. The road bearing his name passes quiet homes and old stone bridges, reminders that courage sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Lieutenant Jack Lee, who led the Americans in that fight, once said little about what happened. He was a soldier, not a storyteller. But his silence spoke volumes. He had seen war at its worst, and, at Castle Itter, humanity at its best. As decades passed, historians began to call it the last battle of World War II. But to those who study it closely, it was something even more remarkable. The only battle where Americans and Germans fought together, not as enemies, but as men defending what was right. It was proof that unity can rise from division, that honor can exist even in defeat, and that light can break through even the darkest storm. Today, when the world once again feels divided, when ideology, suspicion, and fear threaten to fracture humanity, Castle Itter stands as a quiet reminder that no matter the age, no matter the uniform, we always have a choice. To hate, or to understand. To destroy or to defend. To follow orders, or to follow conscience. The lesson of Castle Itter is timeless. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what is right in spite of it. So long as its story is told, the echo of that small fortress in the Alps will endure, a whisper carried through the mountains and across the years, reminding us that redemption, reconciliation, and humanity are never lost, so long as there are those willing to fight for them. Echoes of the last battle. In the shadow of the Alps, where stone and silence have witnessed centuries of war, one fortress still stands, not as a symbol of conquest, but of conscience. At Castle Itter, soldiers who should have been enemies laid down hatred and took up courage. They fought not for glory, not for victory, but for humanity itself. Theirs was the final battle of World War II, and perhaps, the first whisper of a world learning to forgive. Because sometimes, history is not written by those who win, but by those who choose what's right when everything else is lost. And that choice will echo forever.